What if the destruction of Sodom wasn't a punishment at all, but a containment measure? What if something was happening in those cities of the plain, something that had to be stopped so absolutely that the earth itself was scorched and rendered barren, the air turned to poison, and the land cursed forever? The Jordan Valley still bears the scars today, a depression so deep it sits hundreds of feet below sea level, where nothing truly thrives, where the water of the Dead Sea is so rich in minerals that nothing can live in it. Ancient Eblaite tablets, discovered in 1975 and still being translated, preserve commercial records mentioning these cities by name. Cities that existed, traded, prospered, and then vanished in a single day. So before this story pulls you down into its depths, if you find yourself drawn to the histories that the textbooks left unwritten, consider subscribing. Now, as the ancient frequencies begin, imagine yourself in a basement archive in Rome. Not in the grand halls of the Vatican Library with their painted ceilings and gilded frames, but in a modern, functional space at the Sapienza University of Rome, where neon lights hum above metal shelves and air conditioning systems murmur constantly to preserve materials that have survived 4.5 millennia. You are standing before a collection of photographs and plaster casts, reproductions of clay tablets discovered in 1975 at a site called Tel Mardik in northern Syria. Tablets that would eventually be identified as the Royal Archives of Ebla. A city that thrived in the 3rd millennium BCE was destroyed and then forgotten for over 4,000 years until Italian archaeologists brought it back to the light. The original tablets, tens of thousands of them, rest partly in the National Museum of Damascus and partly in Aleppo. Though the chaos of recent decades has made their current status uncertain, it is a stark reminder that even artifacts that have survived millennia can be threatened by the conflicts of a single generation. But here in Rome, the translations continue, the research moves forward, and on the table before you lies a stack of academic papers representing decades of work by epigraphers and historians. Scholars who have spent their careers learning to read the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay from a time before the Egyptian pyramids were even built. Most of these tablets are exactly what you would expect from a royal archive. Administrative records, tax receipts, inventories of grain and livestock, diplomatic correspondence with neighboring kingdoms, the mundane paperwork of a functioning ancient bureaucracy. But scattered among the economic ledgers are references that made scholars pause when they first appeared in translation. References to trade partners and vassal cities whose names felt strangely familiar. The tablets mention a city called Sidamu. They mention Imara. They mention Admanu. They mention Sebaim. They mention Bela. 5 cities, trade partners of the Eblaites, located somewhere in the southern Levant, in the region the tablets call the Plain. If these names seem to echo something from your religious upbringing, something from Sunday school, Torah study, or the cultural memory absorbed through centuries of Western civilization, that echo is no coincidence. Sidamu bears an undeniable phonetic resemblance to Sodom, Imara to Gomorrah, Admanu to Adma, Sebaim to Zeboim, Bela to the city also called Zoar. The 5 cities of the plain, the cities destroyed by fire and brimstone in the book of Genesis, appear to be referenced in the economic records of a Syrian archive that predates the earliest possible date for the biblical text by over 1,000 years. This discovery, announced gradually through academic publications in the late 1970s and 1980s, should have revolutionized our understanding of one of the most famous narratives in the Bible. It should have forced a complete re-examination of what we thought we knew about these cities and their fate. Instead, it was contested, debated, and gradually filed away in academic literature where non-specialists would never encounter it. Some scholars argued that the phonetic similarities were mere coincidences, that Sodom could refer to any other place that we were seeing patterns where none existed. Others accepted the identification, but questioned its significance. After all, the tablets don't describe the destruction. They simply record trade relations that cease to appear in later archives. But that silence is in itself profound. The Eblaite tablets cover several centuries of Bronze Age commerce. The early tablets refer to these 5 cities as active trade partners, sources of specific goods, destinations for Eblaite merchants. And then, in the later tablets, the references simply stop. The cities are no longer mentioned, not as destroyed, not as abandoned, just absent, as if they had never existed. Administrative silence is often more deafening than any dramatic narrative. Something happened to these cities, something so absolute that they vanished, not only from the physical landscape, but from the economic networks they had been part of for generations. This is where your certainties might begin to waver. You were probably taught, if you were told this story at all, that Sodom and Gomorrah were legendary places, moral fables invented to illustrate the consequences of perversion. No more historically real than the Garden of Eden or the Tower of Babel. You were taught that ancient peoples created mythological narratives to explain natural phenomena and enforce social norms. But these stories belong in the category of religious literature rather than historical documentation. But the Eblaite tablets suggest something vastly more complex. They suggest that the cities of the plain were real places that participated in real economies, trading real goods with real neighboring kingdoms, existing within the documented commercial networks of the ancient Near East. They were not legends invented centuries later. They were trade partners whose names were recorded by bureaucrats concerned with tariffs, inventories, and the grounded realities of Bronze Age commerce. And if the cities were real, if they traded, prospered, and participated in the economic life of their region, then their destruction was also real. Not a moral fable spun by later writers, but a genuine historical catastrophe that wiped 5 flourishing urban centers out of existence so totally that they became the subject of the most famous tale of divine judgment in the ancient world. The question that hovers over these silent tablets, the question that academic translators approach with extreme caution, if they approach it at all, is devastatingly simple. If the cities were real, and if their destruction was real, then was the reason for that destruction also accurately preserved? Or were we given a sanitized version, a bedtime story about sin and punishment, because the actual cause was too unsettling, too complex, too threatening to everything that would come after to be recorded plainly? Let me take you back now to the story as most people know it, the version that has been told in religious services, in Sunday school classrooms, and in illustrated children's Bibles for centuries, so that we might examine it closely and notice where it begins to buckle under the weight of its own contradictions. The narrative in chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis begins with Abraham, the patriarch of what will become the Israelite nation, receiving 3 mysterious visitors at his tent near the oaks of Mamre. These visitors are divine beings, though the text is deliberately ambiguous about their exact nature, calling them sometimes men, sometimes angels, sometimes apparently a manifestation of the Lord himself. Abraham offers them hospitality, prepares a meal, and then overhears their discussion about what is about to happen to the cities of the plain. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, they say, and their sin is very grave. Abraham, whose nephew Lot lives in Sodom, begins to negotiate with the Lord in one of the most remarkable scenes of divine bargaining in ancient literature. "If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you still destroy it?" he asks. "No," comes the reply. "What about 45? 40? At every number, the Lord agrees to spare the city if that many righteous can be found." The negotiation stops at 10. Abraham does not ask what happens if fewer than 10 righteous live there. And the text doesn't tell us directly. The implication hangs heavy in the air. There were not 10. 2 of the divine visitors, now clearly identified as angels, travel to Sodom and are greeted at the city gate by Lot, who insists they stay at his home rather than in the public square. That night, the men of the city surround Lot's house and demand that he bring his visitors out so that they might know them. This is the verse that has echoed through centuries of interpretation. Notice the word "know," understood by later readers as a sexual demand. The very origin of the term sodomy, the foundation of theological and legal condemnations that have shaped attitudes toward human sexuality for millennia. But let us pause here and look more closely at what the text actually says and what later interpreters have layered over it. The Hebrew word used is yada, which means to know in multiple senses. Most often, the simple cognitive knowledge of facts or people. Sometimes, the intimate knowledge of sexual union. Sometimes, the deeper knowledge of understanding or recognition. The context determines the meaning, and the context here has been fiercely debated for centuries. What is rarely mentioned in popular retellings is that later biblical texts interpreting the sin of Sodom offer entirely different explanations. The prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after the destruction, offers this diagnosis of what brought the city down. "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. Pride, excessive wealth, complacent ease, neglect of the poor. These are Ezekiel's charges against Sodom." The prophet makes no reference to sexual immorality. The abomination he mentions comes after the social sins, almost as an afterthought. And the Hebrew word used refers in other contexts to ritual impurity, idol worship, or violations of the divine order, rather than specific sexual acts. Even more suggestive is the reference in the New Testament epistle of Jude, which describes Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities as having given themselves up to sexual immorality and having pursued strange flesh. That phrase, strange flesh, comes from the Greek heteros sarkos, which means flesh of a different kind. Flesh that is different, flesh that is other. If the writer wanted to condemn ordinary human sexuality of any variety, the phrase would make no sense. Human flesh is human flesh, but flesh of another kind points to something else entirely, to the possibility that what the men of Sodom were seeking to know was not human at all. This brings us to a connection that most modern readers miss entirely because they were not taught to read these chapters in sequence. Genesis 19, the destruction of Sodom, directly follows the strange, unsettling narrative of Genesis 6. The story of the sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, producing an offspring called the Nephilim, the heroes of old, men of renown. This passage has troubled commentators for millennia. Who were these sons of God? Early Jewish and Christian interpreters understood them to be fallen angels, divine beings who transgressed the boundary between heaven and earth by mating with human women. The descendants of these unions were hybrids, beings of a mixed nature, powerful but corrupted. The flood itself in this reading was sent not just to punish human wickedness in general, but specifically to eliminate this corrupted bloodline, to cleanse the earth of hybrid beings that were never meant to exist. But some survived, or the corruption continued and new transgressions occurred. References to the Nephilim and to clans of giants appear throughout the later biblical narrative in Canaan, where the Israelites were ordered to wage total war against specific populations. In the cities of the plain, something was happening that required not punishment, but complete elimination. Read in this light the fact that the men of Sodom sought to know the angelic visitors takes on a different, far more disturbing significance. They recognized these beings as other, as different, as the kind of flesh their city was accustomed to encountering or producing. They wanted access to them not for a simple assault, but for something tied to whatever had made their city worthy of destruction in the first place. The sin of Sodom in this reading was not sexual immorality in the ordinary sense. It was something closer to the pre-flood transgression, the mixing of species, the violation of the cosmic order, the pursuit of hybridization programs that threatened the integrity of the human species itself. And if that sounds too strange, too far removed from the comfortable moral fable you were taught, consider this. The punishment does not fit the crime, as traditionally explained. Sexual sins of all kinds existed throughout the ancient world. They exist today. They have always been part of the human experience. No other city, no other population was ever subjected to the kind of total annihilation described in Genesis 19. Fire and brimstone from the sky, the overthrow of the cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants and everything that grew on the ground. A destruction so absolute that the region was left uninhabitable for centuries. You do not deploy that level of response for an ordinary sin. You deploy that level of response for an existential threat. Something was happening in Sodom that could not be allowed to continue, that could not simply be punished or reformed, that had to be eliminated at the molecular level. And the text, despite all its ambiguity, despite all the layers of later interpretation that have obscured its original meaning, preserves clues about what that thing was. Let us now examine the destruction itself, as the text describes it, reading the Hebrew terminology closely and noting what kind of event is actually being detailed. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. The Hebrew word translated as sulfur is gafrit, denoting brimstone, a yellow mineral that burns with a characteristic blue flame and produces suffocating toxic vapors. The word translated as fire is esh, the common Hebrew term for fire or flame. But the phrase, "from the Lord out of the heavens," indicates something beyond ordinary volcanic activity. or a natural conflagration. It is directed, intentional, originating from above. What follows is described with a meticulousness unusual for a biblical narrative. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. The Hebrew verb used for overthrow is hafach, which means to turn over, to overturn, to completely transform. It is used elsewhere for the overturning of a bowl, a reversal of fortune, the complete transformation of one thing into another. This is not a simple fire. It is a fundamental alteration. Everything living died. Everything growing was destroyed. The plain itself was transformed. And then comes the detail that has fascinated and puzzled readers for millennia. Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. The Hebrew is netziv melach, a standing pillar or column of salt. Interpreters have offered various explanations, ranging from metaphorical readings about the danger of looking back, to naturalistic proposals about salt encrustation in the Dead Sea region. But read in the context of global destruction, this transformation suggests something more extreme. Instantaneous mineralization. Organic matter converted into inorganic matter. A human body transmuted into a geological formation in an instant of exposure to whatever force was being unleashed. This is not what ordinary fire does to human tissue. Fire burns, chars, reduces to ash. It does not transform flesh into a crystalline mineral structure. Whatever could convert a living person into a statue of salt would have to operate at a level we associate with extreme radiation, with temperatures so high that molecular bonds break and reform in different configurations, with energies that treat organic matter as raw material for inorganic synthesis. Compare this destruction to others in the biblical archives. Cities are conquered and burned throughout the historical narratives. Populations are killed. Lands are sometimes salted to prevent regrowth. But nothing else approaches the language used for Sodom. Nothing else describes a fire from the sky that transmutes human flesh into mineral columns, that turns a fertile plain into a permanent wasteland, or that leaves a region uninhabitable not for years, but for millennia. The closest parallel might be the descriptions of divine weapons in other ancient traditions. The Brahmastra of Hindu texts, which produced effects corresponding to a nuclear detonation. The divine fire Zeus used against the Titans. The weapons of the gods that operated beyond human comprehension. Or the closest parallel might be geological events of catastrophic magnitude. Asteroid impacts, cosmic airbursts in the atmosphere that release energies measured in megatons. Events that leave behind shocked quartz, vitrified stone, and the molecular signature of temperatures no ordinary fire can reach. Whatever destroyed Sodom, it was not a simple conflagration. It was not a military assault. It was not even a particularly severe natural disaster of the ordinary kind. It was something that transformed the very matter of the place, that converted living beings into minerals, that left scars on the landscape that endure to this day. And this brings us to the final piece of this initial exploration. The physical reality of the region where these cities once stood. The place where you can go today, stand in the silence, and feel the weight of what happened there. The Dead Sea sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, a tectonic depression that is part of the Great Rift System running from Turkey to East Africa. At 1,400 feet below sea level, it is the lowest exposed point on the Earth's surface. The water that pools there has no outlet to the ocean. It can only escape through evaporation, which concentrates the dissolved minerals until the salinity reaches 34%. That is nearly 10 times the salt concentration of typical seawater. Nothing lives in the Dead Sea. No fish, no plants, not even the microbial life that colonizes the harshest environments on Earth. The salt concentration is simply too extreme. Organisms placed in this water have their cellular moisture sucked out by osmosis. They desiccate. They die. This sea, which should be teeming with the life common to any body of water in a warm climate, is totally sterile. A liquid desert. Water that kills rather than gives life. The shores and the surrounding landscape match this desolation. White mineral deposits encrust the rocks, forming pillars of salt and bizarre alien formations. The mountains bordering the valley are barren, stripped bare of the vegetation that softens most Middle Eastern terrains. The air shimmers under the heat. The silence is absolute. There are no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no sound of life at all. It feels wrong in a way that is hard to articulate. A landscape that should harbor abundant life, but instead radiates a kind of permanent hostility toward living things. And here is what makes this significant for our inquiry. The biblical text describes this region before the destruction. In Genesis 13, when Abraham and Lot divide the land between them, Lot looks toward the Jordan Valley and sees that it was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. The garden of the Lord. That is the language of Eden, the language of paradise. The most fertile, blessed landscape the author could imagine. The comparison to Egypt, with its abundance nourished by the Nile, reinforces the image of a lush, productive land irrigated by rivers and streams. The region we now call the Dead Sea Valley, this wasteland of salt where nothing grows and nothing lives, was once described as a paradise, like Eden, like the garden of the Lord. Something transformed it. Something took a well-watered plain where cities thrived and trade networks connected communities across hundreds of miles, and turned it into the lowest, deadest, most desolate place on the surface of the earth. And the transformation was permanent. 4,000 years later, the Dead Sea is still dead. The shores are still barren. The mineral concentrations are still lethal to life. What happened here didn't just kill what was living at the time. It altered the fundamental conditions of the environment so that recovery became impossible. The earth itself was sterilized. This is not what natural disasters generally do. Volcanic eruptions devastate regions, which recover in a few decades or centuries as new soil forms and life returns. Earthquakes destroy, and then the rubble becomes the foundation for new construction. Floods recede, the land dries, and plants regrow. Even the detonation sites of atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are today thriving, rebuilt cities in a single generation. But the Dead Sea region has not recovered in 4,000 years. The water there is still poisoned. The shores are still barren. The transformation was so total, so fundamental, that the land cannot heal. And that brings us to the question that will guide our exploration from here. What happened to the cities of the plain? What force was unleashed upon Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim that caused their very location to become a permanent wasteland? And most unsettling of all, What did these cities do to necessitate such complete and irreversible destruction? The Eblaite tablets document their existence. The geology of the Jordan Valley documents their annihilation. The silence between these two sets of records holds a truth we were taught to dismiss as mythology, but which increasingly and uncomfortably looks like history. If you are still with me, if your eyes are growing heavy, but your mind remains engaged, know that we are only just beginning. The evidence goes deeper, the patterns become clearer, and the question of why Sodom had to be erased, not punished, not reformed, not conquered and rebuilt, but erased so completely that the earth itself bears the scar 4 millennia later, leads us into territory the comforting versions of this story were designed to conceal. Let us leave the world of texts and translations now and enter the realm of earthstone and the slow, patient work of archaeology. Because what happened next in the story of Sodom is something most people, including most scholars, never expected to find. It is physical proof that the destruction actually happened, not as a metaphor, not as a theological illustration, but as a catastrophic, datable, measurable event that left scars in the earth we can still examine today. In 2005, a team led by archaeologist Dr. Stephen Collins began excavations at a site called el-Hammam in the southern Jordan Valley, just northeast of the Dead Sea. And what they found over the following years would challenge everything comfortable about how we view the relationship between biblical narrative and historical fact. The site is massive, covering roughly 36 hectares, making it by far the largest Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. Larger than Jerusalem, larger than Jericho, larger than any other urban center for hundreds of miles around. The location matches the biblical geography with unsettling precision. Situated in the well-watered plain of the Jordan, visible from the highlands where Abraham would have stood to look down upon it, exactly as Genesis describes. Positioned along ancient trade routes that would have made it a hub of commerce and wealth, exactly as the texts suggest. For roughly 3,000 years, people lived there continuously, generation after generation, building on the foundations of their ancestors, expanding the city walls, constructing temples, palaces, and the infrastructure of a sophisticated urban civilization. And then, around 1650 BCE, it all stopped. Not gradually, not through the slow decline that characterizes the collapse of most ancient cities, but suddenly, catastrophically, completely, in what appears to be a single day. The excavations revealed a destruction layer unlike anything these archaeologists had seen in their careers. A thin stratum of material telling a story so violent, so extreme, that it took years of analysis before they fully understood what they were looking at. Pottery sherds were found with their surfaces melted into glass, a phenomenon that requires temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Temperatures well beyond what any ordinary fire or even regional volcanic activity could produce. Mud brick structures, the foundational building material of ancient Near Eastern cities, had their outer surfaces vitrified, transformed into a glassy coating that only forms when clay is heated to over 2,000 degrees Celsius and then rapidly cooled. The scattered human skeletal remains discovered showed patterns of thermal damage consistent with instantaneous exposure to flash heat. Bones partially calcified in a way that aligns with a sudden, intense flash rather than prolonged exposure to a fire. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a material researchers compared to trinitite, the glassy substance created at the Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico in 1945, when the first atomic bomb turned the desert sand into molten radioactive glass through the sheer intensity of the detonation. A similar material was found scattered throughout the destruction layer of el-Hammam. Tiny spherules of impact glass that formed when ordinary Earth was superheated to temperatures that shouldn't have been possible in the ancient world, then cooled as it rained back down. In 2021, a comprehensive scientific paper was published in the journal Nature Scientific Reports, authored by a team of 21 researchers from multiple institutions and disciplines, documenting their findings in rigorous technical detail. The paper presented evidence that would have sounded like fantasy had it been proposed just a few decades earlier. Shocked quartz was found in the destruction layer. Quartz crystals subjected to pressures so intense that their molecular structure had deformed in a characteristic way. This only happens under two known circumstances: nuclear detonations and cosmic impacts. Platinum and iridium anomalies were detected in the same layer, elements rare in the Earth's crust, but common in asteroids and comets. Their presence serves as a chemical signature of extraterrestrial material mixed into the debris of the destruction. The pattern of destruction radiated outward from a central point located not on the ground, but above the city, consistent with what scientists call a bolide event, where an incoming object explodes in the atmosphere rather than striking the surface directly. The researchers calculated that the energy released would have been equivalent to a 10-megaton nuclear explosion, roughly 600 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Enough to instantly level every structure within a blast radius of several miles, and enough to generate the temperatures required to produce the vitrified materials, the melted pottery, and the fused glass found at the site. The Airburst hypothesis explained something else that had puzzled researchers: the presence of salt encrusted within the destruction layer at concentrations far above normal soil levels. The explosion, they suggested, occurred over or near the Dead Sea, vaporizing massive quantities of mineral-laden water that then rained back down in the city and the surrounding agricultural lands as a toxic downpour of superheated brine and salt, poisoning the soil so completely that the region remained uninhabited for the next 600 years. This evidence was peer-reviewed, published in a respected scientific journal, and reproduced by independent researchers using different methodologies. Whatever happened at el-Hammam, it wasn't mythology. It wasn't an allegory. It wasn't a story invented by an ancient people to impart a moral lesson. Something happened, something that left physical traces we can measure, something that aligns with uncomfortable precision to what the ancient texts describe: fire falling from the sky, total destruction, salt, and centuries of sterility in its wake. Close your eyes for a moment, if they aren't already, and let that settle into your consciousness. We have archaeological evidence for the destruction of Sodom. Not absolute proof, of course. Science is always provisional, always open to revision. But evidence solid enough to be published in Nature, solid enough to survive peer review, solid enough that serious researchers are willing to risk their professional reputations by stating that a cosmic airburst destroyed this city some 3,650 years ago. The Sunday school story, the tale we were told as children about God punishing the wicked for their sins, might actually be describing something that literally happened. And that realization opens the door to questions far more unsettling than anything the simple moral narrative prepared us for. Because this is where the comfortable scientific explanation begins to fray at the edges, where the neat hypothesis of a random cosmic accident starts to crack, letting something stranger bleed through. The airburst theory beautifully explains the physical evidence. It accounts for the temperatures, the shocked quartz, the platinum anomalies, the salt contamination, and the destruction pattern radiating from a point above the city. What it doesn't explain is the precision. Consider the Tunguska event of 1908, when a cosmic body, likely a comet fragment or small asteroid, exploded in the atmosphere over a remote region of Siberia. The blast flattened roughly 2,000 square kilometers of forest, an area about the size of a major metropolitan region, knocking down trees in a radial pattern extending for miles in every direction from ground zero. Consider the Chelyabinsk event in 2013, when a meteor exploded over the Russian city, the shockwave shattering windows across hundreds of square miles, injuring over 1,500 people with flying glass. Those events were powerful, but they were also geographically dispersed, affecting vast areas with decreasing intensity the further you moved from the blast center. The destruction at el-Hammam was different. The city was totally annihilated, but neighboring settlements were not destroyed with the same totality. The pattern suggests something more focused, more controlled, almost surgical in its targeting, and the ancient texts are explicit about this selectivity. When Abraham negotiates with the divine beings before the destruction, he bargains over numbers, asking if the city might be spared for 50 righteous, then 45, 40, 20, 10. The negotiation implies that the destruction could be called off, that it was subject to deliberation and decision rather than the random trajectory of a block of ice and rock hurtling blindly through space. The angels who visit Lot give him specific instructions on timing, telling him to leave immediately, to flee to the mountains, to not look back. They describe what is about to happen in terms that imply agency, will, and control, saying, "We are going to destroy this place," rather than, "This place is going to be destroyed." They tell Lot they can do nothing until he is safely away, implying a deliberate sequence of events, rather than an uncontrollable natural phenomenon. If this was purely a random cosmic impact, an accident of orbital mechanics that happened to intersect Earth's atmosphere at that exact spot on that exact day, then the timing is extraordinary. The very city identified in ancient texts as marked for destruction is the one a random asteroid fragment happens to strike. The righteous man and his family leave the area just before the impact occurs. The warning given in the narrative precedes an event that could not possibly have been predicted by an ancient observer. The coincidences multiply beyond what probability can comfortably support. Ancient traditions from cultures around the world describe weapons of the gods that bear a striking resemblance to what happened at el-Hammam. The Brahmastra of Hindu texts is described as a divine weapon that could be invoked by mantras and meditation, requiring no physical projectile, unleashing an energy that consumed everything in its path, leaving the earth barren for generations, unable to support life. Greek accounts of the destruction of Atlantis describe Zeus sending fire and earthquakes to destroy a civilization that had become corrupted by the dilution of its divine bloodlines with mortal blood. Egyptian texts describe the burning, destructive eye of Ra, which could be directed against the enemies of cosmic order, reducing them to ash with divine fire. These are not random legends scattered through human mythology without a common thread. They describe a pattern, a capability that divine beings in ancient tradition possessed and were willing to use against targets deemed worthy of destruction. The pattern suggests not a random celestial accident, but deliberate intervention. Weapons that could be aimed, fires that could be summoned, a destruction that operated according to will rather than blind physics. Perhaps this is a step too far. Perhaps we are seeing patterns where none exist, reading intention into coincidence, constructing a conspiracy out of chaos. The scientific explanation remains possible. An airburst event like Tunguska that fortuitously struck this particular city at this precise moment, whose timing was preserved in cultural memory, because that is what surviving humans do. They build narratives around catastrophes. They make sense of senseless disasters. They craft stories to manage trauma. But there is another possibility hovering at the edges of our modern materialistic worldview. A possibility the ancients would not have found strange at all. What if the destruction was targeted? What if something or someone possessed the capability to direct cosmic fire at specific locations? What if the texts are not mythology attempting to explain a natural disaster, but the documentation of an exercise of power we do not yet understand? Now we must ask the question scholars have spent centuries avoiding. What was actually happening in Sodom to merit this level of response? The classical interpretation focuses on sexual sin, specifically homosexual behavior, projecting onto the ancient text moral categories that developed millennia later. But as we discussed earlier, this reading is a late addition, not the original understanding of what went wrong in the cities of the plain. The book of Jasher is not part of the canonical Bible, but it is referenced within the Bible itself, in both Joshua and 2 Samuel. As a source, the biblical authors knew and considered authoritative. This text preserves traditions regarding Sodom that paint a far more detailed and disturbing picture than the brief Genesis account. According to Jasher, the inhabitants of Sodom had developed complex legal systems designed specifically to exploit strangers and travelers. If a foreigner entered the city with goods, the Sodomites would systematically strip him of his possessions, using fabricated legal charges and rigged courts until he had nothing left. They would offer hospitality only to charge ruinous prices for every service rendered. They had institutionalized cruelty, creating laws that punished kindness and rewarded brutality. A famous passage describes what happened to strangers who could not pay the debts accumulated against them through these predatory practices. The Sodomites would place the victim in a special bed. If he was too short for the bed, they would stretch him until he fit. If he was too tall, they would cut off the parts that hung over the edge. This is where we get the word procrustean, passed down through Greek mythology, which may have borrowed the image from these older Middle Eastern traditions. But buried within Jasher's account, alongside these descriptions of systematic cruelty, are hints of something else, something stranger than mere human wickedness. References to the mixing of species, to breeding practices that crossed boundaries that shouldn't have been crossed, to offspring that were not entirely human. The Book of Enoch provides the framework for understanding these hints. In chapters 7 and 8, Enoch describes how a group of divine beings, called the Watchers, descended to earth and took human women as wives, producing a hybrid offspring called the Nephilim. But the Watchers did more than breed with humanity. They taught forbidden knowledge, specific sciences that humans were not meant to possess. The list includes the making of weapons and metalwork, cosmetics and beautification. astrology, and the reading of celestial signs, but also something translated variously as root cutting, knowledge of plants, or the resolving of spells. Some scholars suggest these phrases describe an ancient understanding of what we would today call genetics, the manipulation of biological inheritance, the cutting and grafting of living things, the creation of new forms through deliberate breeding and modification. And there was great impiety and much fornication, and they went astray, and all their ways became corrupt, the text says. The word translated as fornication does not refer to ordinary sexual immorality. In its context, it specifically describes the crossing of boundaries between the human and the divine, the mixing of bloodlines that were meant to remain separate, the continuation of the Watcher's program that had already provoked the catastrophic response of the flood. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Genesis reports just before describing the deluge. Not just human flesh, but all flesh. Something had gone wrong at the biological level. Something that required a total reset. The flood destroyed the world the Watchers had corrupted. But according to post-flood texts, not everything was wiped out. References to giants, to descendants of the Nephilim, to the heroes of old, continued to appear in the biblical narrative after the waters receded. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emites. These names of giant clans appear in the conquest narratives, suggesting that pockets of the ancient corruption survived or re-established themselves in specific locations. Were the cities of the plain such places? Was Sodom a post-flood center for the continuation of antediluvian practices? When the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house and demanded he bring out the visitors so they could know them, did they recognize something different about these beings? Something that marked them as potential genetic material for whatever programs the Sodomites were running. The Hebrew word translated as know is yada, and while it can certainly carry sexual connotations, it more fundamentally means to know in the sense of intimacy, to investigate, to examine, to become familiar with. What if the men of Sodom wanted to examine these visitors, wanted to determine what they were, wanted to incorporate whatever they represented into the ongoing project housed within the city? The severity of the punishment only makes sense if what was happening posed a threat beyond ordinary wickedness. Sexual immorality existed everywhere in the ancient world, often as a religious practice without provoking total annihilation. Cruelty and injustice have characterized countless cities throughout history without earning them erasure from existence. What would justify the response described in Genesis? The complete destruction of multiple cities, the permanent poisoning of the earth, the death of every man, woman, child, and living thing. Only something that threatened the very order of creation. Only something that, if allowed to continue, would irreversibly corrupt what was meant to remain pure. Only the kind of genetic contamination that had already caused the flood, and which the beings tasked with maintaining cosmic order would not allow to take root again. And then there is Lot himself, the supposedly righteous man whose presence in Sodom has puzzled readers for millennia. Why was he there? He was Abraham's nephew, raised in a family following the divine call that brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans to the Promised Land. He had traveled with Abraham, witnessed the divine covenant, seen the miraculous provisions that sustained his uncle through decades of wandering. And yet, when given the choice of where to settle, Lot looked toward the cities of the plain, saw they were well-watered and prosperous, like the garden of the Lord, the text says, and chose to pitch his tent toward Sodom. By the time the angels arrive, Lot is no longer camping outside the city. He is sitting in the gate, the place where legal disputes were arbitrated, where business was conducted, where the elders and leaders of the city held court. Lot held a position of authority in Sodom, a seat among the judges or rulers, a role that would not have been granted to an outsider, maintaining strict separation from the city's practices. His daughters were betrothed to men of Sodom. Integration through marriage alliances, the very thing later Israelite law would explicitly forbid when it came to nations marked for destruction. When the angels warn Lot to gather his family, his future sons-in-law laugh at him, taking his warning for a joke. They don't take him seriously as a moral authority, as someone whose words carry weight in spiritual matters. They see him as he appears, one of them, one who happens to have foreign relatives. After the escape, after the destruction, comes the strange episode in the cave. Lot's daughters, having witnessed the annihilation of everything they knew, believing themselves to be among the last survivors on earth, devise a plan to preserve their father's bloodline. They get him drunk on consecutive nights, sleep with him while he is unconscious, according to the text, and conceive children by him. Their reasoning is explicit. There is no man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. They believed the destruction was total, not just of their city, but of the whole world. They saw what fell from the sky. They felt the heat. They smelled the sulfur. And they concluded that nothing was left. Their solution was genetic preservation, the continuation of the line by any means necessary, even means that in normal times would be unthinkable. The children born of these unions became the founders of the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that would maintain complex and often hostile relations with Israel throughout biblical history. Prophets would later condemn these peoples, sometimes suggesting there was something fundamentally wrong with their lineage, something that made them perpetual enemies of the divine plan. Did Lot's daughters carry something in their blood that the destruction was meant to eliminate? Had their years in Sodom, their betrothals to the men of a city, their integration into its society, introduced a contamination that the fire from heaven was intended to purge? Is the episode in the cave not a story of desperate survival, but of the destruction's failure to achieve complete elimination? The pattern repeats throughout the biblical narrative. Orders to completely destroy certain peoples, to leave no survivors, to kill even the animals and burn the possessions rather than take them as plunder. These commandments, which modern readers find disturbing evidence of ancient brutality, perhaps served a purpose the texts never fully explain. Not punishment for wickedness, but quarantine of a contamination. Not moral judgment, but genetic hygiene. The uncomfortable truth that emerges from a careful reading of these ancient sources is that righteousness, in the biblical sense, may not have meant simply moral behavior as we understand it. It may have meant purity of lineage, the absence of contamination introduced by the Watchers, the preservation of the human form as it was meant to exist. Lot was righteous, not because he was morally superior to his neighbors, but because his bloodline was untainted. His daughters carried that purity, and their desperate act in the cave, though violating moral law, preserved something biologically essential, or corrupted it further, depending on what had happened during their years in Sodom. The story resists comfortable interpretations. The righteous man chose to live in the perverted city, rose to prominence there, and allowed his daughters to intermingle with its people. The destruction meant to eliminate the threat may have failed in its ultimate purpose, if contaminated genetic material escaped through the survivors. The nations descended from the unions in the cave became persistent thorns in Israel's side, as if something in their origins made reconciliation impossible. We are left with questions rather than answers, with a story far stranger and more unsettling than the simple moral tale we were taught as children. Something was happening in Sodom, something that required the most extreme response the divine order could deliver. The evidence suggests the destruction was real. What remains uncertain is whether it achieved its goal, or whether whatever was being cultivated in those cities of the plain found ways to survive, to spread, to continue its work under other names, in other places, through the long centuries that followed. Let these possibilities settle as you rest. The archaeological evidence is solid, peer-reviewed, published in top-tier journals. The textual evidence is there, preserved in documents ranging from canonical scriptures to apocryphal traditions, to comparative mythology. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to look. And the questions multiply as we dig deeper into what actually happened in the Jordan Valley nearly 4 millennia ago, when fire fell from the sky, and cities that had thrived for centuries were erased so completely that for most of history we thought they were only legends. Let's step back now from the specifics of Sodom and look at this in a broader context. Because when you begin to read the ancient texts with fresh eyes, when you discard the comforting assumption that these are simply moral tales for ancient audiences, something unsettling emerges. A systematic program of total annihilation that runs like a dark thread through the entire biblical narrative and beyond, targeting not random populations, but specific peoples in specific territories, for specific reasons that the texts themselves hint at, even if later interpreters softened or concealed them. Consider the order given to King Saul regarding the Amalekites. One of the most troubling passages in all of Scripture, where the prophet Samuel relays the divine instruction to totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. This is not a punishment proportional to a crime. This is not justice as we understand it. This is an order for complete and total elimination, extending even to the animals that cannot sin, to the infants who have committed no offense, extending to the very possibility of continuation. And the Amalekites were not alone. Before entering the Promised Land, the Israelites were given detailed instructions regarding 7 Canaanite nations: the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Peoples who had lived in that territory for generations. Peoples who had built cities, planted vineyards, and established civilizations. And the order was unambiguous. When the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. The justification given in the texts is their wickedness, their abominations, their practices that defiled the land itself. But here is what troubles the careful reader. The exact same practices, idol worship, child sacrifice, sexual rites, and divination, existed throughout the ancient world. Egypt practiced them. Babylon practiced them, Assyria practiced them, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, and dozens of other peoples practiced variations of these same religious and cultural models. Yet none of these nations were ordered to be totally destroyed. They were enemies to be defeated, yes, influences to be repelled, but they were not marked for complete genetic erasure, in the same way these specific populations were. What made these peoples different? What distinguished the Canaanite nations, the Amalekites, and the inhabitants of Sodom from all the other perverted peoples of the ancient world? The texts themselves provide clues that later commentators have often overlooked or deliberately downplayed. When the Israelite spies first entered Canaan, they returned with a terrifying report. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This word points back to Genesis 6, to the sons of God who took the daughters of men, to the giants and the heroes of old, to the corruption of flesh that precipitated the flood itself. The spies were not describing ordinary human enemies of unusual height. They were describing something else, something tied to the pre-flood world, something that should have been wiped out in the waters, but which somehow had persisted, scattered across specific territories, concentrated in specific populations, carrying bloodlines that the divine order could not allow to continue. The Anakim, these giant descendants of Amak, occupied Hebron and the hill country of Judah. The Rephaim, another clan of giants whose name literally means the dead or the healers, depending on the etymological reading, controlled territories in the Transjordan and the region around Ashtaroth Karnaim. The Emites, meaning the dreaded ones, inhabited the territory that would become Moab. The Zamzummim, the buzzers or schemers, occupied what would become Ammonite territory. These were not simply tall people. The texts describe them with a precision that suggests something categorically different. Og, king of Bashan, explicitly called the last of the Rephaim possessed a bed measuring 9 cubits by 4 cubits, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. A bed preserved as a wondrous artifact in the Ammonite capital of Rabbah. Either this was an absurd exaggeration serving no narrative purpose, or it was the documentation of something genuinely anomalous. A being whose physical dimensions required furniture on a non-human scale. And when we mapped the territories marked for the harem, the ban, this total devotion to destruction that tolerated no survivors and no mercy, they overlap exactly with the territories associated with these clans of giants. The hill country where the Anakim resided, the Transjordanian regions where the Rephaim ruled, the cities of the plain where something so terrible was happening that fire had to fall from the sky to sterilize the very soil. The Hebrew concept of harem deserves special attention because it operates differently from ordinary warfare or punishment within the ancient legal and religious framework. Objects or peoples placed under the harem were not simply conquered or killed. They were devoted to destruction in an almost sacred sense, removed from ordinary existence, banned from any possible integration or continuation. When Achan violated the harem at Jericho by keeping some of the devoted plunder, his entire family, all his animals and his possessions were destroyed. The contagion, whatever it was, could not be allowed to spread through contact, possession, or bloodline. This is a logic of quarantine. This is a containment protocol. You don't quarantine behavior. If the problem were merely cultural practices, those could be reformed through education, integration, or the gradual influence of different values. The Egyptians had abominable practices, but were never marked for erasure. Joseph married an Egyptian. Moses married a Midianite, then a Cushite. Ruth the Moabitess, despite Moab's origins in the incestuous cave after Sodom's destruction, was integrated into Israel and became an ancestor of King David himself. The ban was not absolute regarding foreign peoples in general, but these specific populations, these nations occupying territories associated with the pre-flood giants, these clans carrying the blood of the Nephilim or their descendants. They had no possibility of integration. They were not to be educated, reformed, married, or absorbed. They were to be eliminated so totally that nothing remained. Not for what they did, but for what they were. Not because of their practices, but because of their genetics. Not as punishment for crimes, but as prophylaxis against contamination. The destruction of the Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnaim during the time of the kings who fought in the valley of Siddim, the same valley that housed Sodom and Gomorrah, preceded the destruction of the cities of the plain. The elimination of the Anakim in Hebron by Caleb and later by Joshua's armies systematically removed the giant clans from the hill country. The defeat of Og of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim, ended that particular lineage. And throughout these campaigns the same protocol applied. Total destruction. No survivors, no integration. The land itself reclaimed and purified. If we are honest with the texts, if we let them say what they seem to be saying, rather than forcing them into comfortable moral frameworks, a terrible pattern emerges. Something happened before the flood, corrupting the human genetic heritage. The flood was meant to wipe out this corruption, to cleanse the earth and start fresh with the uncorrupted line of Noah. But somehow, whether through survival in isolated refuges, through renewed contact between the visible and invisible realms, or through mechanisms we can no longer reconstruct, the contamination persisted. Pockets of corrupted bloodlines survived, concentrated in specific territories, manifesting as clans of giants and peoples with unusual physical and perhaps psychological traits. And the divine response, as documented in these ancient texts, was not rehabilitation, but elimination. Not punishment, but prevention. Not the judgment of past sins, but the protection of future humanity against an existential biological threat. Sodom fits perfectly into this paradigm. The cities of the plain were not destroyed simply because their inhabitants were inhospitable, sexually deviant, or arrogant in their prosperity. They were destroyed because something was happening there, something tied to the pre-flood corruption, something that could not be left unchecked, something that required not just the death of the inhabitants, but the permanent sterilization of the earth itself. The same fire from the sky, the same total destruction, the same salting of the earth that would prevent regrowth for millennia. This was not a proportionate response to moral failure. It was biological warfare against a genetic threat. Let us widen our horizon now and look beyond the Hebrew Scriptures. Because if this were merely a quirk of Israelite theology, we could dismiss it as the xenophobic mythology of a specific ancient culture. But the exact same pattern appears across civilizations that had no contact with one another, separated by oceans and millennia, yet telling remarkably similar stories about divine human hybridization leading to corruption and then to catastrophic destruction. Consider Plato's account of Atlantis, passed down in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, presented not as myth, but as historical record transmitted by the Egyptian priesthood. Atlantis was founded, according to this account, by Poseidon, a god who fell in love with a mortal woman named Clito. Their union produced hybrid descendants who became the royal dynasty of the island civilization. These divine human hybrids possessed extraordinary capabilities, and built a civilization of unprecedented power and sophistication. But over the generations, as the divine blood was diluted through successive human mixing, the Atlanteans degraded. The divine portion faded away, Plato writes, and human nature gained the upper hand. They became greedy, aggressive, imperialistic. They sought to conquer the known world. And Zeus, perceiving their degradation, gathered the gods to determine their punishment. The dialogue breaks off before describing the destruction itself. But other references indicate that Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night of terror, submerged beneath the waves, never to rise again. The parallel to the biblical pattern is striking. Divine beings mating with human women. Hybrid offspring of unusual power and capability. A civilization born of this hybrid foundation. A gradual corruption as the divine element is diluted or misused. A decision by the gods that destruction is necessary. A total annihilation, leaving no survivors and no possibility of continuation. Different cultures, different divine figures, different geographical settings, but the essential narrative arc is identical. The Sumerian texts tell their own version. The Epic of Atrahasis, which predates the biblical flood narrative by centuries, describes the gods creating humans to take on the labor the gods themselves found too burdensome. But humans multiplied too quickly. They became too numerous. They made too much noise. This noise disturbed the gods, particularly Enlil, who decided to reduce the human population through plagues, droughts, and finally, the flood. Classical interpretation views this noise as literal, the racket of an overpopulated world disturbing divine sleep. But the term used, rigmu, carries connotations beyond simple sound. It can mean tumult, agitation, rebellion, the disruption of proper order. And intriguingly, Atrahasis contains references to the corruption of the human form, to inappropriate mixing, to the degradation of the original design of creation. The noise might be metaphorical, the sound of a creation going wrong, of a species becoming something other than what it was meant to be. After the flood, in the Mesopotamian accounts, the gods take steps to limit human capabilities. They introduce mortality, disease, infertility, social barriers to unrestricted reproduction. They build in constraints that pre-flood humanity apparently lacked. This is not a punishment for past behavior, but engineering against a future risk. Modifying the species to prevent a recurrence of what went wrong before. The Popol Vuh, the creation epic of the Quiché Maya, describes multiple attempts to create humanity, each ending in destruction. The first humans, made of mud, dissolve and fall apart. The second, made of wood, function mechanically but lack consciousness and gratitude. They are destroyed by a flood attacked by their own tools, and animals reduced to the monkeys of the forest. Only the third creation, made of corn dough, succeeds. But even these humans are too perfect at first. They can see everything, know everything, perceive to the very edges of the universe. The gods, disturbed by this excessive capability, cloud their vision. They limit their perception. They reduce them to something more manageable. The pattern recurs. Created beings exceeding their intended parameters. A divine response involving limitation or destruction. Survivors or new creations engineered with constraints that earlier versions lacked. The cosmos brought back into balance through the elimination of what shouldn't exist and the modification of what remains. The Indian traditions contain perhaps the most explicit descriptions of divine weapons used against cities and civilizations. The Brahmastra, described in the Mahabharata and other texts, was a weapon requiring no physical projectile, invoked by mantras and intention, capable of destroying entire armies or cities in a single discharge. Its effects included intense heat, a wind that killed without burning, water rendered undrinkable, survivors losing their hair and nails, children born deformed for generations. These descriptions, recorded in texts thousands of years old, correspond with unsettling precision to the effects of nuclear weapons. The thermal radiation, the shock wave, the water contamination, the acute radiation syndrome, the genetic damage manifesting in subsequent generations. And archaeological sites in the Indus Valley, particularly Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, show evidence of sudden, catastrophic destruction. Vitrified bricks, skeletal remains in positions suggesting instantaneous death, layers of ash and destruction followed by abandonment rather than reconstruction. Mainstream archaeology attributes these destructions to invasion, earthquake, flood, or slow decline. But the vitrification, the evidence of extreme heat, the pattern of flash death rather than combat injury, all of it aligns uncomfortably well with the ancient textual descriptions of divine weapons capable of turning cities to ash in moments. Whether these weapons were literal technology possessed by ancient, now lost civilizations, or whether they represent something else entirely, interventions from beyond the human realm, using mechanisms we cannot understand or duplicate. The textual records hold the memories of destruction by fire from the sky, targeting specific cities for specific reasons. The pattern across cultures, continents, and millennia remains constant. Divine or semi-divine beings interacting with humanity. Knowledge or genetic material transferred when it was not meant to be shared. Civilizations rising and exceeding their bounds. A catastrophic destruction eliminating the transgression, with survivors or new creations given limitations to prevent recurrence. Sodom fits into this global pattern. It was not an isolated incident of divine pique or moral judgment. It was an instance of a recurring program, a periodic cleansing when certain boundaries were crossed. When certain contaminations became too severe, certain threats to the cosmic order required sterilization rather than simple correction. The fire that fell on the cities of the plain obeyed the exact same logic as whatever sank Atlantis drowned the pre-flood world, destroyed the cities of the Indus Valley, and wiped the giant clans from Cayman. Let us consider now what was actually being taught. What knowledge was being transferred? What made certain peoples and civilizations so dangerous that total elimination became necessary? The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, provides the most detailed account of what the Watchers, those fallen divine beings who descended in the days before the flood, taught to humanity. The list is specific and strange. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. The arts of metallurgy and warfare far beyond what humans should have possessed at that stage of development. He taught the beautification of the eyelids, the use of cosmetics and ornaments, the manipulation of appearance. He taught the working of precious stones and dyes, luxury crafts requiring sophisticated chemistry. Other Watchers taught root cutting, which traditional interpretation understands as herbal medicine, but which the phrase itself suggests could include the understanding of heredity, of lineage, of how living things grow from their origins, and might be manipulated at that foundational level. They taught the resolving of spells, translated variously as counter-magic, or the nullification of supernatural effects, but potentially pointing to a technological understanding that neutralized natural limits. They taught astrology and astronomy, not just reading fortunes in the stars, but understanding the cosmic mechanics, the cycles and forces governing existence. They taught the signs of the earth, the moon, and the sun, the knowledge of geomancy, earth energies, the relationships between celestial bodies and terrestrial effects. Each of these teachings seems relatively harmless in isolation. Metallurgy, cosmetics, herbalism, astronomy. These are civilizational advances humanity would have eventually developed. What made them forbidden? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the knowledge itself, but in its timing, its source, and its combination. Imagine a primitive human population suddenly handed advanced metallurgical capabilities, able to forge bronze or iron weapons, when their neighbors possessed only stone. The power imbalance would be catastrophic. Imagine that same population given an understanding of genetics and selective breeding. The ability to manipulate the fundamental blueprints of heredity combined with the divine genetic material the Watchers were simultaneously introducing through their unions with human women. This becomes far more sinister than crop improvement. The Nephilim children of these unions were not just tall. They were the heroes of old men of renown, beings whose capabilities exceeded ordinary human parameters. If their creators also taught the principles by which such beings were produced, the root cutting, the understanding of how bloodlines combine and can be directed, what was emerging was not just a hybrid population, but a breeding program, a deliberate effort to create something new, something that mixed divine and human elements in a way the cosmic order had never sanctioned. The corruption of all flesh that the Genesis text describes just before the flood takes on new meaning in this light. It wasn't just moral corruption, not just behavioral degradation. The flesh itself, the genetic substrate, the biological heritage of earthly creatures, had been corrupted, modified, manipulated, transformed into something other than what the original creation intended. The flood wasn't a punishment for bad behavior. It was a total reset, an attempt to wipe the corrupted programming and restore the original specifications. But the reset was incomplete, whether through Noah's own ancestry, whose text notes, "He was perfect in his generations," a phrase that has puzzled commentators for millennia, or through the survival of hybrid populations in high-altitude refuges, or through a fresh descent of beings from the invisible realm after the flood. The contamination persisted. It concentrated in specific territories. It manifested in specific populations. The giant clans, the nations marked for the harem, the cities of the plain, and the response was the same as before: elimination. Not because of what these populations did, but because of what they were, because of what they carried in their blood, because of what they might produce if left unchecked, because of what they might teach if allowed to spread their understanding. The forbidden knowledge wasn't just intellectual, it was biological, woven into the genetic structure of hybrid populations, encoded in bloodlines that had to be completely stopped. This is why the infant and the nursing child had to die alongside the warrior and the elder. This is why the animals had to be destroyed when they could have been taken as useful plunder. Why the earth itself had to be rendered sterile for generations. The contamination wasn't behavioral, it was constitutional. And Sodom, if we read the texts carefully, if we pay attention to the details. Later interpreters softened or hid, was a hub for the continuation of this exact program. The men of the city who surrounded Lot's house, demanding he bring out his visitors so they could know them, recognized that these visitors were different, were other, were not ordinary human travelers. Their response was not random mob violence. It was a coordinated attempt to capture genetic material, to continue the breeding program, to acquire what the divine visitors possessed. The fire that fell was not a punishment for lust. It was the prevention of hybridization. The sterility that followed wasn't collateral damage. It was the intended effect. Walk with me now along the shores of that Dead Sea and feel what the earth itself remembers. The Jordan Rift Valley is the deepest exposed scar on the surface of the earth, a wound in the planet's crust where tectonic forces are slowly pulling Arabia away from Africa. The Dead Sea sits at the bottom of this rift, 1,412 feet below sea level, the lowest point of dry land on Earth. Nothing quite prepares you for the anomaly of this place. The water, if you can call it water, is so saturated with dissolved minerals, particularly sodium chloride, that it has the viscosity of oil, the taste of battery acid, the character of something that shouldn't be liquid at all, but has been forced into that state against its nature. Nothing lives in it. No fish, no algae, no bacteria in its depths. The extreme salinity, the mineral load, the chemical hostility of the water make it incompatible with the cellular processes that define terrestrial life. The shores are crusted with white crystalline salt formations, beautiful in their geometry, completely barren in their implications. The surrounding landscape bakes under a heat that reflects off the mineral surfaces with a blinding intensity. Vegetation is sparse to non-existent in the immediate vicinity. What does grow in the wider region struggles, stunted, malformed, clinging to existence in conditions that actively oppose life. And the geological record confirms it was not always this way. The texts describe the region before the destruction as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt for its fertility. The Jordan Valley, watered by the river before it reached its final evaporation point, supported abundant life. The cities of the plain were thriving commercial hubs precisely because the region was fertile, welcoming, rich in resources. Something transformed it. Something unleashed the mineral deposits that had accumulated in the subterranean layers. Something heated the ground to temperatures that vitrified the upper surfaces and melted the crystalline structures below. Something spread a contamination across the landscape so deeply that 4,000 years of weathering and erosion have not restored the original fertility. The thermal event theory suggests an atmospheric cosmic explosion, a meteor that detonated, releasing energy measured in megatons without leaving a crater. Flash heating the ground surface, melting sulfur deposits, igniting anything combustible, and releasing the subterranean minerals that poisoned the water and soil for millennia. That is the standard scientific explanation for the evidence found at el-Hammam and the surrounding region. But consider the alternative interpretation, the one the texts themselves suggest. What if the sterility wasn't the collateral damage of a cosmic accident, but the intended result of a deliberate sterilization? What if the fire from the sky was directed, targeted, calibrated to achieve exactly this effect? What if salting the earth wasn't an unfortunate consequence, but the very goal? The message carved into the geology for future generations to read. Nuclear test sites remain dangerous for decades, even centuries in some cases. The soil is contaminated. The water is unsafe. The land is quarantined. Not because of what happened there, but because of what remains. The residue of forces that shouldn't have been unleashed. The dormant poison that lingers long after the initial event. The Dead Sea region was avoided, considered cursed, recognized as permanently altered by cultures that knew nothing of radiation or nuclear physics. They only knew that something had happened here. Something that broke the earth in a way that doesn't heal. Something that turned paradise into a permanent wasteland. Standing on its shores today, feeling the mineral-heavy wind blowing off the water, squinting against the glare of salt deposits stretching in every direction, you can feel it. The absence, the anomaly, the memory preserved in the stones and the soil itself of an event so catastrophic the earth never recovered. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't the proportional instructive consequence of a moral failure. It was an elimination, a sterilization, a quarantine enforced by fire and maintained by chemistry. Whatever was happening in the cities of the plain, whatever bloodlines were being cultivated, whatever knowledge was being preserved and passed down, it had to be stopped. So completely that not only the population was wiped out, but the very possibility of continuation was foreclosed. The earth was salted, the water poisoned, the land cursed for millennia. And somewhere in the collective memory of global civilizations, the story was preserved, softened into a moral tale, reduced to an allegory about sexual sin and divine judgment, but still carrying for those who read carefully the echo of something far more disturbing. Something was happening in Sodom that required not punishment, but prevention. Something was growing there that could not be allowed to spread. The fire that fell was not a judgment, it was prophylaxis. And the scar it left, still visible 4,000 years later on the barren shores of a sea that shouldn't be dead, stands as a permanent testament to power, purpose, and threats we are only beginning to understand. Let us try something difficult now. Something that requires holding multiple threads together and weaving them into a single tapestry. A reconstruction of what might have actually happened in the Jordan Valley nearly 4,000 years ago. Not the Sunday school version, not the academic dismissal, but a synthesis that takes both the ancient texts and the modern evidence seriously, that treats the scribes of antiquity as witnesses rather than myth-makers, that asks what they were trying to tell us before the redactors softened the language, before the theologians moralized the narrative, and before the academics dismissed the whole thing as primitive fiction. Around 1650 BCE, in a valley so fertile that Genesis itself compared it to the Garden of Eden, a civilization thrived at the peak of its power and prosperity. The city we call Sodom was the largest urban center in the southern Levant, a massive Bronze Age metropolis whose walls enclosed wealth accumulated over centuries of trade. Its name appears in Eblaite tablets, in Egyptian records, in the commercial correspondence of Mesopotamian merchants. Caravans came and went along the trade routes traversing the Jordan Valley, carrying copper bitumen and the famous salts of the region, returning with grain, textiles, and luxury goods from distant lands. The city stood at the crossroads of the ancient world, growing fat on commerce, proud of its success, becoming reckless in its wealth, its isolation, and its sense of invulnerability. But Sodom was known for something else, too. Something that made travelers avoid it when they could. Something the later scribes who compiled the Genesis narrative found too unsettling to preserve in full detail. The language was softened in the canonical version, the specifics obscured, the crime reduced to something their audience could understand and condemn without asking too many questions. Sexual immorality, they said, wickedness and sin. But if you read the original sources carefully, if you consult the texts that didn't make the canonical cut, if you trace the older traditions preserved in works like the Book of Jasher and the Book of Enoch, and the fragments cited by the early church fathers, a different picture emerges. The cities of the plain had become, or perhaps had always been, centers for practices that echoed what had been wiped out in the Great Flood. The mixing of species that were not meant to be mixed, the preservation of bloodlines that should have perished, the pursuit of hybridization experiments that threatened the integrity of the human species as it was designed to exist. Remember what Genesis tells us preceded the flood, how the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives, how the Nephilim walked the earth in those days. Giants, heroes, and beings of renown who were neither fully divine nor fully human. Remember how the corruption of all flesh, not just human flesh, but all flesh, prompted the decision to wipe the slate clean with water, to preserve only Noah and his family and the animals that had not been tainted, to start over with a population that was still purely what it was meant to be. The flood was supposed to end that. The hybrid lines were supposed to be destroyed. But ancient texts hint that somehow, somewhere, the contamination survived or was reintroduced. The Nephilim reappear after the flood in the lands that would become Canaan, in the territories marked for complete destruction. The giant clans, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Amites, the Zamzumin, all occupying specific territories, all eventually targeted for total annihilation. And right in the middle of this geography of forbidden bloodlines, the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, flourishing in their fertile valley, practicing their secret arts, preserving what should have been lost. When the angels came to Sodom, they came on a reconnaissance mission. They came to confirm what was suspected, to see with divine eyes what had been reported, to verify if the outcry against the city was justified. And what happened when they arrived tells us something crucial about what was really going on there. The reaction of the male population was not random mob violence, nor ordinary sexual assault against strangers. The text specifies who showed up at Lot's door that night. All the men of the city, from the youngest to the oldest. The entire population, from every quarter. This was not a riot. It was a mobilization. The whole male populace organized and coordinated, surrounding the house, demanding Lot bring out his visitors so they could know them. The Hebrew used is yada, the same word used for Adam knowing Eve, for sexual union, for the most intimate form of knowledge. They recognized that these beings were different. They knew what they were, and they wanted access to them, wanted their genetic material, wanted to continue the program the cities of the plain had been running for generations. Lot's response is bizarre, until you understand the context. He offers his virgin daughters instead. a horrifying substitution that makes no sense if this is ordinary sexual violence, but makes terrible sense if it is about genetics, breeding, and the specific value of hybrid or non-human genetic material that could not be replaced by ordinary human women. The mob refuses because it isn't the daughters they want. They want the angels. They want beings outside the human genetic pool. They want to continue the work of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The mixing that had corrupted the pre-flood world. The hybridization that violated the boundaries of creation. The angels end the confrontation by striking the mob blind. A display of power that confirms their non-human nature, that proves the mob was right about what they were, even if they were wrong about their ability to capture them. And then, in the darkness before dawn, the angels render their verdict. The reconnaissance is over. The reports were accurate. The city and all its sisters have crossed a line that cannot be tolerated. This isn't about punishing moral failures. This is about eliminating an existential threat. Flee, they tell Lot. Take your family and run. Do not stop. Do not look back. What is coming next can have no witnesses. What we are about to do will erase this place so completely that nothing will be left to rebuild. Nothing will survive to carry on. Nothing will grow on this soil for generations. The destruction came from above. The text says, sulfur and fire from the Lord out of the heavens. For centuries we read that as divine metaphor, as theological language of judgment, as mythological exaggeration. But now we have the archaeological proof. We have the vitrified pottery at required temperatures over 2,000 degrees. We have the melted mud bricks, the trinitite-like glass, the shocked quartz, and the platinum anomalies. We have a destruction pattern consistent with a massive atmospheric bolide event, a cosmic impact detonating in the atmosphere above the city with the force of a nuclear weapon, vaporizing everything below it in an instant of absolute annihilation. Was it a lucky asteroid strike? A random cosmic event that just happened to hit exactly the city marked for divine destruction? Exactly at the moment the righteous man escaped, and exactly in the manner predicted by ancient texts. The math strains credulity. Or was it something directed, something aimed, unleashed by beings who had the power to call fire from the sky and the will to use it? The texts describe angels as messengers, servants of divine will, executors of judgment. But they also describe them as warriors, as beings of terrible power, as entities capable of blinding mobs with a gesture and summoning destruction from the heavens. We have no framework to understand what they actually are, what technology or capability they might possess, or what it looks like when beings from outside our physical reality decide a particular contamination must be sterilized. The destruction was total. The text is explicit about this. The cities were overthrown, the entire plain consumed, all inhabitants killed, everything growing on the ground destroyed. The Hebrew word is hafach, overturn, upset, turn upside down. The same word used for flipping a bowl, for a complete reversal, for total transformation. It wasn't a fire, it was a molecular reorganization. It was the transmutation of matter. It was the conversion of a thriving ecosystem into a permanent wasteland. In the aftermath, the region was transformed into what remains to this day. The fertile valley became a salt desert. The living waters became the Dead Sea, so dense with minerals that nothing can survive in it, so heavy with dissolved salt that human bodies float effortlessly, so toxic to life that even bacteria struggle in its depths. the lowest point on the surface of the earth. A depression in the crust that shouldn't exist according to standard geological processes. A permanent scar on the landscape, bearing witness to an ancient violence we are only beginning to comprehend. Lot's wife looked back. Perhaps she couldn't help it, unable to resist the urge to see the destruction of everything she had known, the home she was leaving forever, the life she was abandoning. Or perhaps she looked back for other reasons, an attachment to what was being destroyed, a longing for the city and its practices, a final glance at the program that was coming to an end. Whatever the motivation, the text says she became a pillar of salt, and in a region now covered in salt columns, withstanding mineral formations on the barren shores, with crystalline structures that look almost human in a certain light. We might ask if this is a metaphor or a description. Did she simply die in the shockwave, her body buried by the mineral fallout that coated the region? Or did something stranger happen? A transformation we cannot explain, a literal transmutation of flesh to mineral, in the moment the boundaries of normal physics collapsed in the presence of the force being unleashed. Lot and his daughters took refuge in a mountain cave, the only survivors of the civilization of the plain, carrying in their traumatized minds the memory of everything that had been destroyed. And what happened next in that cave? The daughters' uncertainty, their belief there were no more men on earth, their decision to preserve their father's seed through incest, their founding of the Moabite and Ammonite bloodlines. This too points to something deeper than ordinary survival psychology. They believed the destruction was total, the end of the world as they knew it. They thought they were the final repositories of their line. Either the trauma was so severe they couldn't think clearly, or they knew something about the scale of the destruction that the text hasn't fully preserved. The nations born from that cave, the Moabites and Ammonites, would become stubborn enemies of Israel. Their territory targeted in conflicts, their bloodlines viewed with suspicion. Their origins forever marked by the shadow of Sodom. Were these bloodlines contaminated too, passing on something from the cities of the plain despite the destruction? Later prophets would have much to say about these peoples, and almost none of it good. So here is the reconstruction. Speculative, but grounded in the evidence we have examined. The cities of the plain were not destroyed for ordinary wickedness, for sins that exist in every human society, for moral failures that would hardly justify the complete annihilation of multiple urban centers. They were destroyed because they had become or remained hubs of genetic contamination, for the continuation of pre-flood hybridization programs, for practices that threatened the integrity of the human species and the order of creation itself. The destruction was not a random cosmic accident, but a targeted intervention using means we cannot fully comprehend, carried out by beings we cannot fully grasp, for purposes extending far beyond simple moral judgment. The goal was not punishment, but sterilization, not justice, but quarantine, not vengeance, but prevention. Something was happening in those cities that could not be allowed to continue to spread to succeed. And whatever power governs these things decided that complete elimination, total erasure, the permanent scarring of the earth itself, was the only acceptable response. This interpretation raises uncomfortable implications that we must now consider. Implications about the nature of divine intervention, about what is hidden from us in our sanitized religious narratives, about the persistent concern with genetic purity running through ancient texts, and about what the physical evidence actually demonstrates. If this reconstruction is even partially accurate, if the beings we call God gods, or angels, operate according to the logic suggested by the original texts, then we live under a form of cosmic governance quite different from the one acknowledged by most religious traditions. The concern is not primarily at the level of moral behavior, of human ethics, of the kind of sins every society wrestles with. The concern is at the level of existential threat, of boundaries that must not be crossed, of contamination that must not spread. We are being managed, preserved, protected from ourselves and from influences that would turn us into something other than what we are meant to be. Or, to put it more darkly, we are being controlled, kept within parameters we did not choose, and pruned back whenever we grow in directions the cosmic gardeners deem unacceptable. The destruction of Sodom was not unique. It fits into a series of total annihilation orders running through the ancient texts. The herem, the ban, the absolute destruction commanded against peoples occupying specific territories with specific histories. The Amalekites destroyed to the last infant. The Canaanite nations promised to elimination. The giant clans hunted to extinction. Each of these commands, horrifying to our modern ethical sensibilities, only makes sense if the stakes were not behavioral, but biological. Not cultural, but genetic. Not wickedness, but contamination. This is profoundly uncomfortable. The modern mind recoils from questions of genetic purity, and rightly so, given how such concerns have been weaponized in recent history. But our discomfort does not change what the ancient texts actually say, does not alter the evidence they preserve, does not erase the pattern they reveal. We can dismiss it as primitive mythology, as the projection of human prejudice onto divine beings, as a theological rationalization for territorial conquest. Or we can ask if the ancients knew something about their own history that we have forgotten. If they were documenting events they witnessed or were told about by reliable sources. If they were preserving for future generations warnings about the crossing of forbidden boundaries. The redaction of the ancient texts obscured much of the original narrative. The sexual interpretation of Sodom's sin appears to be a later development, a moralization that masks a far more disturbing original tradition. The scribes who compiled Genesis into its final form, working perhaps during the Babylonian exile, inherited oral traditions and written fragments centuries old. They made choices about what to include and omit, what to emphasize or downplay, what to keep literal, and what to soften to make it acceptable. And then there are the texts that didn't make the canonical cut. The Book of Enoch, with its detailed account of the Watchers. The Book of Jasher, with its precise descriptions of the city's practices. The Book of Giants, found at Qumran. These preserved traditions that the redactors apparently found too dangerous, too unsettling, or too detailed to include in what would become scripture. Yet these texts were not lost. They circulated for centuries, were quoted by the early church fathers, preserved in Ethiopian and Slavonic translations, and found again in the caves by the Dead Sea. The information survived despite efforts to minimize it, and now, with archaeological evidence confirming that the destruction really did happen, that impossible temperatures were reached, that the pattern of annihilation matches what a cosmic impact or a directed energy weapon would produce. We have to ask if the texts we have are complete, if the version we know is the original, if the story of Sodom is a children's tale, told to adults who weren't ready for the real story. Let these ideas settle now as you breathe. You don't have to accept this reconstruction. You don't have to reject it either. These are possibilities that exist in the space between what we can prove and what we cannot dismiss. In this territory, where evidence and interpretation intertwine, where ancient wisdom and modern discovery converge without quite solidifying into certainty, the physical proof is measurable, documented in peer-reviewed journals. The interpretation is speculative, reaching beyond what science can confirm into territories where only the ancient texts offer guidance. Together they form a picture that is neither a comforting myth nor a cold, materialistic explanation, but something in between, something that honors both the physical reality of the destruction and the textual claims about its purpose and origin. The destruction layer at el-Hammam does not lie. The vitrified pottery does not lie. The shocked quartz and platinum anomalies do not lie. Something happened there that science is only beginning to explain. Something that aligns with what the ancient texts described millennia before we had the tools to verify it. Perhaps it was a cosmic fluke, a meaningless impact event that coincidentally struck a city later mythologized into divine judgment. But the ancient world did not see it that way. The survivors and their descendants saw a pattern and a purpose, a warning and a meaning. They saw a message carved into the barren earth that they felt compelled to preserve for future generations. Whether they were right about the purpose, whether there truly are uncrossable boundaries and powers that enforce them, whether we live under a cosmic governance that occasionally intervenes with fire from the sky when certain experiments go too far. These are questions that remain open, but the evidence demands we ask them. The texts demand we take them seriously. And the salt-encrusted shores of a dead sea demand we remember what once thrived there, and what brought it to an end, so absolute that the earth itself still bears the scar. We must now ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Not about what happened in the past, but about what might be happening in the present. Not about ancient cities destroyed, but about whether the conditions that triggered their destruction are making a return. Not about a cosmic judgment millennia old, but about whether we are approaching a similar threshold today. The pattern we've identified is clear enough. Forbidden knowledge transferred or developed. Genetic manipulation crossing species boundaries. Technological capabilities reaching beyond appropriate limits. Hybridization programs, mixing what must remain separate. And then a catastrophic total intervention, resetting the experiment, eliminating the contamination, starting fresh with a population that hasn't yet crossed the line. Consider what we are doing right now. Not in speculation, but in labs and research institutes around the world, with government and corporate funding, with peer review publications and the full apparatus of scientific legitimacy. CRISPR technology allows us to edit genes with a precision unimaginable a generation ago. We can now modify the human germline, make changes that will be inherited by all future generations, alter the fundamental code that defines what a human being is. The technology is regulated, certainly. The applications are limited, officially. But the capability exists, and capabilities tend to be used once they exist, to spread beyond their intended bounds, to fall into the hands of those who care less for ethics or limits than for results. Human-animal chimeras are being created in laboratories, embryos combining human and animal genetic material, beings that are neither fully one nor fully the other. The stated goal is medical, growing human organs in animal hosts for transplants, developing better models for human diseases. But the boundary between human and non-human, that fundamental boundary the ancient texts seem so concerned with maintaining, is being deliberately blurred. How far can this go before it triggers the response, whatever it was, that destroyed the cities of the plain? Artificial intelligence is creating minds that did not evolve naturally. Manufactured consciousnesses, beings that think, perhaps feel, and certainly process information with increasing autonomy. We are creating in our own image now, playing the role the texts assigned to the Elohim, the divine council. Those beings who said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Is this the accession to the forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers? The technology that provoked past interventions. The capability that turns creatures into something they were not meant to be. And transhumanism. This movement aiming to transcend human limits through technology. To merge with the machine. To upload consciousness into digital substrates. To become something other than the biological beings we have been throughout history. This too echoes patterns described by ancient texts. The aspiration to become like gods, knowing good and evil, living forever freed from the constraints of mortal flesh. The Tower of Babel was an attempt to reach heaven through technology, and it was stopped, confused, scattered before it could succeed. Are we building another tower, this time with silicon and code rather than bricks and bitumen? These are not predictions. The texts do not tell us exactly what will trigger the next intervention, if that is even what these events truly represent. But they do preserve a pattern, and patterns tend to repeat. As it was in the days of Noah, one text says, so it will be. The mixing of species, the corruption of what must remain pure, the crossing of appropriate boundaries, the accumulation of power and knowledge without the wisdom to use it responsibly. All of this was happening before the flood. All of this was happening in Sodom. And all of this is happening now, accelerating year by year as the ability to modify life itself moves from science fiction to lab reality, to commercial application, and to widespread availability. Perhaps there are limits we haven't hit yet. Perhaps the line is further out than we think. Perhaps there is no line at all. No cosmic force, no beings watching to see if we cross boundaries established before we existed. Perhaps the destruction of Sodom was just a lucky coincidence. The flood, just a local catastrophe mythologized into a global reset. The Nephilim, just a tribal memory of unusually tall people. And we are alone in a universe that neither knows nor cares what we do with our genes, our technologies, and our aspirations. But the ancient texts suggest otherwise. The physical evidence suggests otherwise. The patterns suggest otherwise. And if the texts are right, if there truly are boundaries that must not be crossed, and powers that enforce those boundaries when necessary, then we are running an experiment whose outcome we cannot predict. Chasing capabilities whose very acquisition might trigger consequences we cannot imagine. The point is not to frighten, but to observe. The texts preserve warnings for a reason. They were written, copied, recopied, preserved through millennia, translated into every language, studied by every generation, precisely because someone thought we needed to know. Someone thought the destruction of Sodom was not just history, but precedent, not just a past event, but a future possibility. Not just the judgment of an ancient city, but a warning to all cities, all civilizations, all peoples who might one day reach the same threshold and face the same choice. We have the warnings. Whether we will listen is another question. Whether there is even anything to listen to, any real cosmic governance, enforcing limits. We do not see beings watching our progress toward boundaries we do not recognize until we cross them. That remains an open question. But the salt-encrusted shores and the barren earth, the melted pottery and the vitrified ruins, those are not open questions. Those are facts. Something terrible happened there. Total, transformative. And whatever we believe about why it happened, the very fact that it did happen should give us pause. Let's return now to the physical landscape, to the place where it happened, to that earth which still remembers even after 4,000 years. The sun is setting over the Jordan Valley, and the heat of the day radiates from soil that has absorbed warmth for millennia without bringing forth the life that should match its ancient fertility. The excavation trenches at el-Hammam cut through strata of accumulation. If you stand at the edge and look down, you can see the stratigraphy of time itself, the sequence of human occupation laid bare for examination. Below the black line, life. Pottery sherds, cooking pots, mud brick walls of homes where families lived, argued, loved, and died. Tools for grinding grain, beads for adorning bodies. All the ordinary debris of ordinary existence in an ancient city. The material residue of people who woke up every morning to go about their business, having no idea that everything they knew would end in an instant of absolute destruction. Black. Absolute. The violence. The stratum of annihilation. Thin but unmistakable, marking the instant when normalcy ceased and the catastrophe began. The pottery here is different. Surfaces heated white-hot and turned to glass. Shapes distorted by thermal shock. The very clay transformed by temperatures that shouldn't have existed outside a furnace, a volcano, a directed energy weapon, or a cosmic impact, or whatever mechanism the beings called angels used when they decided this city and its sisters had to be undone. Above the black line, nothing. Silence. Abandonment. Centuries of wind-blown dust and slow accumulation where no one lived, where no one built, where no one dared return to soil that had been cursed with sterility. In a region marked by salt and death, and by the memory of fire from the sky. The archaeologists work meticulously along the edges of this layer, brushing dust from artifacts that have waited 4,000 years to tell their story. Photographing every find, cataloging every fragment, piecing together the picture of what happened here. Confirming in material detail what the ancient texts described in theological language. Unaware, for the most part, that they are working a crime scene. That the evidence they gather speaks not just of ancient history, but of current possibilities. That the ruins whisper warnings to anyone with ears to hear. The Dead Sea stretches out a few miles to the east. Its surface is glass smooth. Its waters so heavy with dissolved minerals, they bear the weight of floating tourists marveling at the novelty of effortless buoyancy. These tourists generally aren't thinking about why the sea is dead, why nothing grows in waters that should be teeming with life, why the entire region feels somehow wrong on a level that precedes thought and touches something older, instinctive, sensing the presence of an ancient catastrophe, even when the conscious mind dismisses such notions as primitive superstition. The salt pillars along the shore stand like sentinels, mineral formations sculpted by wind and water into shapes that sometimes look almost human, that catch the light in a way that makes you look twice, that seem to turn their heads slightly when you aren't looking directly at them. Lot's wife, the local guides all say, pointing to this formation or that one. Turn to salt for looking back. The tourists laugh, take photos, and don't wonder what she was looking back at. What was so important to see that she couldn't resist the temptation? What transformation actually took place in that moment of disobedience when the fire fell, the world collapsed, and she turned her face back toward everything she had known? The heat makes the air shimmer above the landscape as the sun dips toward the horizon. In an hour, it will be dark, and the stars will come out over this ancient killing field. The same stars that watched the destruction. The same constellations the priests of Sodom might have studied for signs and portents before those signs arrived in the form of two strangers at the city gate. What happened here was not natural. The evidence makes that increasingly clear. The temperatures, the distribution of damage, the specific markers of a cosmic impact or directed energy. None of it fits into normal geological or meteorological categories. Something intervened. Something from above. Something the ancient texts describe as the Lord out of the heavens, and modern astronomy might describe as a bolide airburst, or which remains entirely unexplained, beyond our current capacity to model or understand. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing of all. Not that it happened, because catastrophes happen. Asteroids fall. Civilizations collapse. The universe is under no obligation to preserve human habitat. But that it happened exactly where and when the texts said it did. To the people the texts said deserved it, with effects matching the descriptions given by witnesses or their descendants, with results that endured for millennia, exactly as the curse proclaimed. Coincidence strains credulity at a certain point. The probability of a random cosmic airburst hitting exactly the cities marked for divine destruction, exactly at the moment the one righteous family escaped with the exact total annihilation specified by the texts. That probability is not zero, but it is vanishingly impossibly small. Either the texts are lying and the destruction didn't happen as described, but the evidence says it happened exactly as described, or the texts are recording a coincidence of such magnitude that it actually proves the existence of pattern and design in the universe. Or the texts are accurate, and the destruction was not a coincidence at all, but a targeted, timed intervention executed by beings with the capacity to bring fire from the sky and the will to use it. The ruins whisper. Listen if you can. Listen to what the earth remembers. Listen to what the salt preserves. Listen to the silence that has lasted 4,000 years, the absence of life in a region that was once paradise, the permanence of a destruction designed to be permanent. Somewhere, in a museum, in a climate-controlled case, clay tablets preserve the names of cities wiped out so completely we thought they were only myths. The tablets were baked in ancient kilns struck by the styluses of scribes, recording trade relations and transactions. And perhaps in texts we haven't yet found or translated, warnings about what was happening in the cities of the plain. Reports sent to distant kings about the strange practices of those wealthy, isolated, doomed communities. Until we started digging, we didn't know these cities were a real place. Until we analyzed the destruction layer, we didn't know the annihilation described in the texts had actually happened. until we found the shocked quartz, the platinum anomalies, and the vitrified materials. We didn't know the fire from the sky was anything more than a metaphor. Now we know. The evidence mounts with every excavation season. The picture sharpens with every analysis of the destruction layer's materials. The texts these ancient witnesses so long dismissed as mythology are being vindicated by the very science that once seemed to disprove them. And the question is no longer whether it happened, but why? Why these cities? Why such totality? Why this permanence that has lasted for millennia? Why the warnings preserved, passed down and translated into every language spoken by humanity? The ruins whisper their answer. But perhaps we are not ready to hear it. Perhaps we are not ready to accept that there are lines not to be crossed, powers that enforce those boundaries, and inevitable consequences when those lines are violated. We might prefer to believe in coincidence, in the random cosmic impact, in a meaningless destruction carrying no message and implying no ongoing surveillance. But the earth remembers what we prefer to forget, and the salt remains as a testament to what happened when a civilization crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, and fire came down from the sky to ensure it would never cross that line again. The story has endured for nearly 4,000 years, and that endurance is itself a kind of evidence, a testament that something in this narrative refuses to fade, that demands to be remembered, even when the memory is incomplete, distorted, or expurgated for audiences who might not be ready for the whole truth. Think about what it means for a memory to survive across 4 millennia, crossing the boundaries of language, culture, and religion, passing from Sumerian clay tablets to Hebrew scrolls, to Greek translations, to Latin manuscripts, to printed Bibles, to become digital text on glowing screens in the dark of your room right now. The story of Sodom has traveled through time like a message in a bottle, thrown into the ocean of centuries. And somehow, strangely, it has washed ashore here tonight, still legible, still urgent, still carrying whatever warning, whatever wisdom, or whatever terrible truth the original witnesses felt compelled to preserve. Civilizations have risen and collapsed since those cities burned. Empires that seemed eternal have turned to dust. Languages have been born, died, and been forgotten so completely we no longer even know how to pronounce the words their speakers used to describe love, fear, or fire falling from the sky. And yet this story remains the question that should haunt us. The question that hovers over everything we've explored tonight is whether we remember it correctly, whether the version that survived is the one originally told, whether the layers of interpretation, redaction, and theological addition have preserved the core truth, or buried it beneath comforting fictions that let us sleep without nightmares. Because there are layers to this story, and each layer contains a piece of the truth. But taken together, they form something far more complex and far more unsettling than any single layer can capture. There is the Sunday school version, the one most people hold in their memories. The simple moral tale where God punishes wickedness and the righteous escape just in time. A story of sin and consequence that fits perfectly into a child's understanding of cosmic justice. A story that reduces the complexity of the ancient texts to a single lesson: be good or you will be destroyed. Then there is the historical version, the one that emerges when you set theology aside and examine the evidence with an archaeologist's eye. The version that says, Yes, they really were cities in the Jordan Valley. Yes, they really traded with distant lands. Yes, their names appear in archives dating 1,000 years before the Bible. And yes, they really were destroyed suddenly and completely around 1650 BCE, leaving behind ruins that would not be significantly inhabited again for centuries. This version strips away the supernatural framework and simply asks, what happened here? And can we find physical evidence of it? And we can. We have. Excavations at el-Hammam and surrounding sites have revealed destruction layers with temperatures that shouldn't be possible for ordinary fire. With vitrified pottery, flash-heated human remains, and minerals that only form in conditions of catastrophic, overwhelmingly sudden heat. The historical version validates the core claim. Something terrible happened here. Something real. Something that left scars we can still measure, analyze, and examine in labs far from the salty shores of the Dead Sea. Then there is the textual version. The one that emerges when you read the original Hebrew closely. When you consult the texts that didn't make it into the canon. When you trace the references and connections linking Sodom to the broader narrative of pre-flood corruption, to the Watchers and their forbidden teachings, to the Nephilim and their hybrid bloodlines, to the systematic programs of genetic contamination the ancient sources describe with unsettling precision. This version suggests the sin of Sodom was not sexual immorality in the conventional sense, but something far stranger and more threatening. The pursuit of programs that had already caused a global catastrophe. The preservation of bloodlines that should have been wiped out. The practice of arts and sciences never meant for human hands. This version explains why the destruction had to be so total. Why the earth itself, not just the populations, had to be sterilized. Why the region remains cursed and barren to this day. Each of these versions holds its share of truth. The Sunday school version is true in its recognition that there are moral boundaries and consequences for crossing them. The historical version is true in its insistence that we can find physical proof of events the ancients recorded. The textual version is true in its recovery of dimensions of the story that later redactors deemed too disturbing or complicated to keep. But altogether synthesized and held in tension, they form something vaster than any single interpretation. A pattern suggesting the familiar narrative isn't wrong, but rather incomplete. The simplified version of a much more complex, troubling reality. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway from this journey. Not a new certainty to replace the old one, but an openness to complexity, a willingness to sit with questions that don't resolve neatly. The recognition that stories surviving 4,000 years usually do so because they contain something true and important, even if we have forgotten exactly what that something is. You sensed it all along, didn't you? You may have felt since childhood that the story of Sodom, as you were told it, didn't quite add up, that the punishment seemed disproportionate to the crime as described, that something was being hidden, covered up, or euphemized beyond recognition. Tonight, perhaps, that intuition found some validation. Perhaps you see now that your suspicion wasn't a lack of faith or cynicism, but a form of wisdom. The recognition that inherited narratives often contain strata beneath the surface, depths that reward those willing to dive deeper than the comfortable shallows. We cannot prove the speculative reconstruction we've explored tonight. We must be honest about that. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. The patterns we've traced might be the product of our perception rather than discovery. The ancient texts we've consulted are themselves the product of transmission, translation, and interpretation over millennia. And we cannot be certain we are reading them correctly, or that we aren't projecting our own frameworks onto elements that meant something else entirely to their original audiences. The cosmic airburst hypothesis for el-Hammam is compelling, but not universally accepted. The links to Nephilim bloodlines and forbidden knowledge represent one interpretive tradition among others. The cross-cultural parallels might reflect common human experiences and psychological patterns rather than memories of similar real events. We must hold our conclusions loosely, provisionally, aware that new evidence could reshape everything we think we understand, but neither can we simply dismiss what we found. The physical evidence of catastrophic destruction at el-Hammam exists regardless of how we interpret it. The temperatures documented in the destruction layer are real, measurable, anomalous. The parallels across different cultures, even if they admit other explanations, remain striking in their consistency. The internal logic of the ancient sources, once read carefully and in context, holds together in a way that rewards, rather than punishes, close attention. The geological permanence of the Dead Sea region, its continued sterility after nearly 4,000 years, testifies to something extraordinary having happened there. Something that altered the chemistry of the soil itself, from which it has never fully recovered. The appropriate response to all this might be humility rather than certainty. These questions have been asked for thousands of years by minds just as sharp as ours today. By scholars, mystics, skeptics, and believers. And they have not been definitively resolved. We are not going to resolve them tonight in these quiet hours between waking and sleep. But we can keep them with us. We can let them work on us. We can let the mystery remain mysterious without feeling we have failed to reach a conclusion. Sometimes the questions have more value than the answers they might produce. More generative. More conducive to an ongoing search. All knowledge may not be for us just yet. That is a difficult truth for modern minds to accept. Accustomed as we are to believing all mysteries can be solved with enough data and computing power. That ignorance is always temporary, and truth is always accessible to persistent inquiry. But the ancient scribes who carved these stories into clay understood something we may have forgotten. That certain truths require preparation. That some knowledge is dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands or at the wrong time. That the gradual unfolding of understanding over generations may be wiser than the sudden revelation of everything all at once. They preserved what they could in the forms available to them. They encoded warnings in myth and narrative, embedding truths that would survive even when the surface meaning was lost or altered. They believed future generations would find what they needed when they were ready to receive it. We may be that generation. The convergence of archaeological discovery, textual study, and scientific analysis in our time has opened windows into the ancient world that were closed to previous centuries. We can read Sumerian. We can excavate with precision. We can analyze microscopic structures in pottery sherds and detect platinum anomalies in sediment layers. We have tools our ancestors lacked, and those tools are revealing dimensions of ancient events that were inaccessible until now. Or perhaps we are just another link in the chain. Not the generation that finally understands, but one more set of seekers passing the baton, adding our discoveries to the accumulated wisdom, preparing the ground for those who will come after us, who may see more clearly than we do. Either role is honorable. Either contribution matters. The key is to keep searching, to refuse easy certainties that stifle the quest, to remain open to the evidence, no matter where it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable places. Let these questions dissolve now into sleep. They will be there tomorrow morning, patient and persistent, waiting for your return. The tablets wait in their museum cases in Damascus, Rome, London, and Chicago. The clay pressed against climate-controlled glass. The cuneiform symbols as crisp as the day they were carved. The ruins rest undisturbed in the Jordan Valley, the excavation trenches revealing their layers of destruction and life, then destruction again, to the rhythm of civilizations rising and falling, preserved in the stratified earth. The Dead Sea keeps its stillness, a surface unbroken by the slightest wave or current, a salt concentration so high that nothing can sink in it and nothing can live in it. A strange mirror reflecting the empty sky. Nothing is lost in resting. The mystery has waited 4,000 years. It can wait one more night. Tonight we have traveled from a clay tablet in a museum to the shores of a dead sea, from the reassuring Sunday school narrative to the uncomfortable possibilities that ancient texts actually describe something far stranger and more unsettling than simple moral punishment. We have examined archaeological evidence of destruction, temperatures that shouldn't be possible, cross-cultural parallels suggesting shared memories rather than independent inventions. Textual strata, revealing dimensions of history systematically obscured by later redactors. We have asked what was really happening in Sodom that called for not punishment but elimination, not discipline but sterilization, not just the death of the guilty, but the permanent cursing of the earth itself. We have not answered this question definitively. Perhaps no one can. Perhaps the answer is buried too deeply beneath the accumulated sediment of 4 millennia, erased too completely by the very destruction it would explain. But we asked the question. We took it seriously. We refused to accept the comforting version when the evidence demands something else. And that refusal, that willingness to keep searching, even when certainty remains out of reach, connects you to every seeker who has ever faced this mystery and wondered. You are not alone in the night. Across time and space, beyond the boundaries of language, culture, and belief, others have asked the same questions, felt the same unease, sensed that the story they were told was not the whole story. The ancient scribes who first recorded the destruction of Sodom were among them. The later editors who softened and simplified the narrative were reacting to that unease which has always accompanied this tale. The archaeologists excavating the Jordan Valley are part of that same long chain, using different tools but driven by the same impulse to know, to understand, to recover what was lost. Somewhere, nearly 4,000 years ago, a scribe sat by the light of an oil lamp and pressed a stylus into wet clay, carving a story he had been told, a story that seemed too important to be lost, too terrible to be forgotten. He didn't know his tablet would survive the fall of empires, the rise and decline of religions, the slow erosion of millennia. He didn't know someone in an unimaginably distant future would learn his language, decipher his symbols, and read his words on a glowing screen in a darkened room. He only knew this story mattered, that it had to be preserved, that forgetting it would be a form of betrayal to those who lived it and to those who might need its warning. He trusted the clay, He trusted time. He believed the truth, however partial or distorted, would eventually reach whoever needed it. And here you are, 4,000 years later, receiving what he preserved. The sulfur has long since cooled. The fire from the sky is now nothing more than sedimentation in an archaeological layer. A thin black line separating what came before from what followed. The cities of the plain are silent mounds in a valley forgotten by time, their names preserved only in scattered texts and contested identifications. But the memory persists, pressed into clay, recorded in sacred books, kept alive across the millennia, waiting for someone to look past the children's version and ask the dangerous question, what really happened there? And why did it have to be erased so completely that the earth itself still bears the scar 4,000 years later? The answer, whatever it is, has waited these 4,000 years. It can wait one more night. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities, vanished peoples, and fire falling from an empty sky. Dream of angels walking streets soon to be ash. Of a man fleeing to the hills with his daughters, while the world behind him turns to light, to heat, and to a permanent silence. Dream of pillars of salt, of barren shores, of questions with no answers, or answers too strange to be accepted, of truths too terrible to be written plainly in texts children might read, and know that in the morning the mystery will still be there. The tablets in their museum cases, the ruins of the Jordan Valley, the barren shores of the sea that shouldn't be dead. And that irrepressible, troubling, wonderful human impulse to keep asking the questions, even when the answers do not come. Until then, rest. The story has been told, or at least one version of it, one layer among many, a thread in a tapestry woven over 4 human millennia of forgetting, then remembering again. The questions have been asked, the evidence weighed. The mystery has been honored with attention, if not solved with certainty. And you, fellow traveler, in these quiet hours, have joined that long chain of those who refuse to accept easy answers when the evidence demands something more. That refusal is its own form of wisdom. That quest is its own form of prayer.